Someone left a comment on this channel. 38 likes, 4 replies. It reads, "People always saying that Neoth is a bad parent when Erda exists. Also, they think Guilliman came out right because he had a mom. I don't think being raised by Guillimom wouldn't change the other Primarchs by much." That comment collected its 38 likes and got buried, because most people didn't know how to respond to it, because most people have never heard of Erda. Every lore video tells you the Emperor was a bad father, arrogant, cold, distant. But the real villain of the Primarch origin story might not be the Emperor at all. What if the person who truly damned humanity was the mother you've never been told about? The community has been arguing about the Emperor's parenting failures for years. The meme is so saturated it barely registers as a take anymore. It's ambient 40K discourse, background radiation. The bad father argument has its own dedicated YouTube videos. Reddit threads run into the hundreds of comments. It has become the default frame for understanding the Heresy's origins. Repeated so often it has stopped feeling like an interpretation and started feeling like canon. Almost nobody asks about the mother, the one who confessed, the one whose name Malcador the Sigillite invoked when someone asked who actually scattered the Primarchs, the one a word-bearer hunted down during the siege of Terra and accused of being the architect, the scatterer, the instrument of the gods themselves. She appeared as a named, speaking character in exactly one novel, confessed to something that changed the shape of the entire galaxy, and then largely disappeared from the community conversation. Most lore channels that cover the Horus Heresy have never mentioned her once. Her name is Erda. She is fully canonical Black Library, introduced by Dan Abnett in Saturnine, Siege of Terra, Book 4. She has a lexicanum entry. She has a death date listed in that entry. She matters more to the origin of the Horus Heresy than almost any character this community talks about. And the prosecution's case against her opens not with inference, but with her own words. First, understand what category of being she was, not metaphorically, but precisely. Erda was a perpetual. In the lore, a perpetual is an immortal human, not unkillable exactly, but resurrecting, die, rebuild, return, sustained by some mechanism baked into the soul. The Emperor himself is the most powerful perpetual who ever lived, magnitudes more powerful than all others of his kind combined, per the Siege of Terra novels themselves. Malcador the Sigillite, over 6,700 years old by the dawn of the 31st millennium, was almost certainly one. Olanius Person, the guardsman who stood before Horus at the end of everything, was one. These are the hidden structural columns of human civilization, ageless, operating in the shadows of recorded history for tens of thousands of years, steering civilizations from behind the figures who held the thrones. Erda was among the oldest. Her lexicanum entry lists her birth as prehistory, which tells you almost nothing until you read the trivia section, where she is noted to have claimed personal knowledge of the maker of the Venus of Willendorf. That figurine was carved approximately 30,000 years before the current era. She was ancient when ancient history was still being invented. A bust inscription from a Siege of Terra source describes her precisely. An ageless perpetual, a powerful, enigmatic figure who was once close with the Emperor in a way that few others ever were. Her role in the birth and evolution of the Primarchs is a mysterious one, as are her origins, but her knowledge of chaos and the dark powers assailing Terra are beyond dispute. Remember that last line. It becomes important later. She met the Emperor during Terra's earliest documented period.
He was known as Neoth then,
a warlord king in the age of the first cities, already moving through human history with a purpose most of his contemporaries couldn't name. She became one of his followers, one of many perpetuals he was assembling around his long-term project to guide humanity towards something that could survive what was coming. Over the following millennia, most of those perpetuals abandoned him. His methods were becoming too aggressive, too interventionist, too much the conqueror, not enough the guide. One by one, they left. Erda stayed. She stayed through the early wars, through the conceptual foundation of everything the Imperium would eventually become, through the transition from secret architect to open emperor. She stayed because she believed in him, and she stayed long enough to become indispensable to the most ambitious biological engineering project in human history. The Primarch project began in M29, in a secret underground laboratory on Terra, overseen by the Emperor alongside Erda and Biotechnical Division Director Amar Astard. The project's goal was 20 superhuman demigod generals, genetic creations built from the Emperor's own DNA, engineered to mature into the supreme commanders of a force that would reconquer the galaxy. But the Emperor's genetics alone weren't sufficient. He needed something specific. He needed Erda's rare gene stock. The Lexicanum's entry for Erda states it plainly. As the project began, Erda's skills as a geneticist greatly aided the Emperor, but he later also required her rare gene stock for the Primarchs to be born. The Emperor of Mankind entry confirms it from the other direction. He combined his own genetic material with Erda's. The Primarch project entry is unambiguous. Combining Erda's genes with the Emperor's resulted in the birth of the Primarchs, making Erda functionally their mother in the same way the Emperor is their father. Without her specific gene stock, the Primarchs don't exist. She isn't a footnote to their creation. She is half the genetic architecture of 20 of the most powerful beings humanity has ever produced. The Emperor couldn't build them without her, and she knew exactly what that meant. Then, the Emperor excluded her from their lives entirely. She could observe the 20 children growing in their artificial gestation chambers, the gene-culturing vats in the underground laboratory. She couldn't hold them. She couldn't speak to them. The Emperor was preparing them for the Great Crusade, calibrating them for a single purpose, and Erda, the woman whose genetic code ran through every one of those children, was locked outside the door. Her sons would be soldiers, the finest soldiers ever conceived, the vanguard of a galactic military campaign that would consume everything it touched. She had spent millennia watching the Emperor accelerate human development by force, wars, purges, the demolition of old power structures, the ruthless optimization of everything for survival. She understood what the 20 in those chambers were being shaped into. Instruments. Loved in the way a craftsman loves exceptional tools, perhaps, but instruments nonetheless. She wanted them to grow free, to be, in the Lexicanum's phrasing, more fully human beings instead of engineered tools. She despaired at what the Emperor had planned, and she dismantled it. This is where almost every other lore channel stops. They describe the Chaos Gods breaching the Emperor's laboratory, the warp storm, the 20 gestation pods torn from their vault and scattered across the galaxy. Clean, impersonal, an act of cosmic malevolence by the eternal enemies of mankind. The Emperor as victim, the ruinous powers as the only culpable actors. The story ends there. Saturnine. Siege of Terra Book 4 by Dan Abnett tells a different story, and it does so through the only person in a position to tell it. The novel finds Erda in self-imposed exile at Guelb, an ancient site in Mauritania in northwest Africa, close to her birthplace. Picture the setting. dry, ancient, pre-Roman, pre-recorded, a place that has been inhabited for as long as humans have inhabited anywhere on Terra. She has been there for a long time, long enough to have servants, a routine, the quiet rhythms of a woman who has withdrawn from the world entirely. Living with her is a prototype space marine designated Li2, serial number LE2, a legionary built from the same Emperor and Erda gene stock before the technique was refined into the Primarchs themselves. He was among the first successful legionary templates ever made. He is her genetic son as surely as the 20 were, and his only loyalty is to her. He has sworn to protect her from the Emperor or anyone else who seeks to harm her. John Grammaticus arrives. He is a fellow perpetual, directed to her location through information attributed to Eldrad Ulthran. He needs her help getting into the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, needs to find Olania's person, needs to do whatever it takes to alter the course of a war that is almost lost. What he gets instead is a confession. I did. I took them from him. I cast them onto the tides to spare them from his terrible ambition. Not a theory, not a community interpretation. Those words, in Erda's voice, spoken to John Grammaticus, recorded in Saturnine Part 2, Chapter 3. The woman who provided half the genetics for 20 Primarchs, taking direct responsibility for what happened to them, framing it as an act of maternal rescue performed against a project she had decided she could no longer support. Malcador the Sigillite had already pointed at her. In The Fury of Magnus, when the scattering comes up, Malcador's response is brief and damning. No, she saw to that. Not the Chaos Gods, not a warp storm, not some unnamed force of cosmic entropy. She saw to that. The First Lord of Terra, the man who knew more of the Emperor's designs than anyone else alive, attributing the Primarch scattering to one specific person without hesitation. Then there is Erebus, the word-bearer who had given Horus the anathema blade. He hunts Erda down during the siege in Chris Wright's Warhawk, Siege of Terra Book 6, and confronts her in her garden at Guelb with an accusation built in 3 precise parts: the architect, the scatterer, the instrument of the gods themselves. 3 novels, 3 characters. Erda confesses, Malcador attributes, Erebus accuses. Now the mechanism, because the mechanism determines exactly what category of crime this is. Erda didn't walk into a temple and make a deal with Khorne. There is no canon scene showing her contacting a demon, striking a bargain, pledging herself to any of the 4 powers. What the novels describe, across Saturnine, Warhawk, and the residual chaos energy the prequel novel Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, detects in the Primarch Vault, is this. She dismantled the Emperor's protective wards on the gestation chambers. She removed the seals and barriers he had constructed around those 20 pods. Her stated intention was to scatter her sons away from the Emperor before he could use them as planned. What she didn't account for, or refused to account for, was that the moment those protections came down, the Chaos Gods were already positioned on the other side of them. Warhawk is explicit. The scattering wouldn't have been possible without her intervention. Erebus tells her directly that the ruinous powers are grateful she acted, but aren't entirely sure why she did it. That last detail is its own kind of horror. The most malevolent entities in the universe used her as a mechanism without needing to explain themselves to her, without needing her to agree to anything, without needing to offer her anything in return. She unlocked the door. They chose where the children went.
Erebus's phrase is the canonical precision of this. Not a collaborator, not an ally, an instrument, which is to say, a key in a lock she didn't realize she was holding. In Warhawk, when Erebus confronts her, she deflects. A partial exchange from the novel captures it. "I had my disagreements with him," she said at last. "Somehow you discovered those, but they were hardly kept secret. We differed, and we still—" Read what she is doing in that passage. She is distributing responsibility across every available variable. Her disagreements with the emperor reframed as philosophical differences, nothing kept hidden, nothing catastrophic in isolation. Everyone carries a share. Everyone except Erda. Erebus then shifts tactics. He uses a psychic assault to force the full truth into her consciousness. Not philosophical truth, but experiential truth. The scale of suffering traceable back to that one decision in a laboratory on Terra. The Heresy. The siege consuming the horizon outside her door. The billions dead across the galaxy. The Primarchs on their demon thrones. The civilizations devoured. Warhawk shows her going to her knees under the weight of it. Not because of Erebus's physical power, but because of the sheer magnitude of what she is being made to see. He floods her with the reality of what she did, and it breaks her in ways his armies couldn't. She still refuses to join chaos. This matters for the verdict, and we'll return to it. When Erebus offers her a place in chaos's victory and she refuses, she does not yield. She does not submit. Erebus puts his athame blade to her throat and demands she worship him. She spits blood in his face. He kills her with the blade, an athame forged from shards of the anatheme, the same weapon that had mortally wounded Horus at Davin. A weapon specifically engineered to permanently end a perpetual, bypassing the regeneration that makes their deaths temporary. Erda, who had lived since before the earliest human cities, who had claimed to know the maker of a 30,000-year-old artifact, who had helped the emperor build the conceptual foundation of the Imperium, died in a garden in Mauritania on 014 M31, refusing to give chaos the thing it asked for. The Lexicanum records her death date and closes her active period. The Litu entry tells what happened after. He had traveled with John Grammaticus through the siege, fought his way to Lupercal's court, been blasted aside by Horus along with the other lesser fighters who had come with the master of mankind. He survived. He was present when the emperor was returned to the imperial palace. And then, in the aftermath recorded in The End and the Death, Volume 3, by Dan Abnett, Litu was found sitting alone in a room, waiting to be interrogated, sorting through a tarot deck he had assembled from his own collection and cards recovered from the Vengeful Spirit. The first prototype Space Marine, built from the same gene stock as the Primarchs, the man who had defended Erda for decades and watched the siege consume everything, just sat there in the aftermath, making meaning from wreckage. The channel's previous video surfaced a comment with 301 likes from @TheDarkKnight727. Evil can't create anything new. It can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have created. Tolkien. Aimed at the Chaos Gods. It fits Erda's case with uncomfortable precision. The ruinous powers didn't construct the Horus Heresy from nothing. They corrupted what Erda placed within their reach. She removed the protections from 20 genetically engineered demigods and left them exposed to warp entities that had been waiting, with the patience that timeless malevolence allows, for exactly this kind of opening. The corruption that followed was inevitable the moment those wards came down.
A comment with 166 likes from @GraySingerWOWSL on the same video. Big E being an idiot for not telling the Primarchs about chaos. Do you know why the Unification Wars took hundreds of years longer than the Great Crusade? Because there was chaos on Terra. He has seen what just some knowledge can do to humanity. Multiple canonical novels build the structural argument underneath this. The Last Church by Graham McNeill shows the Emperor in conversation with the last priest on Terra, explaining in his own voice why religion must be dismantled. He knows the gods are real. He knows they exist as warp phenomena fed by belief and emotion, that worship is a mechanism which amplifies them into something increasingly difficult to contain. His push for the imperial truth isn't denial of chaos. It's a calculated attempt to deny chaos the fuel it runs on. He has identified the source of the problem and is engineering a civilization that starves it. The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden shows Malcador explaining this policy to Lorgar directly. The four great powers are real, worship feeds them, and the Emperor has deliberately suppressed knowledge of chaos throughout both humanity and the legions. The concealment is institutional policy, implemented from the top with full awareness of what it protects against. The Master of Mankind, again by Dembski-Bowden, shows the Emperor prosecuting a long, secret war against warp entities throughout human history. The Webway project isn't vanity, it's an escape architecture. A path through the stars that doesn't require warp travel and the chaos exposure that comes with it. He has watched what happens when psychic excess goes unchecked. The Eldar Empire is the most visible example in galactic history. A civilization that dreamed and felt and created its way into accidentally birthing a god that ate most of its species. The Emperor has been taking notes on civilizational collapse for 30,000 years. His secrecy is a survivor's response to a threat he has watched destroy everything it touches. There is a genuine flaw in how that policy was applied. It was extended even to Magnus the Red, the Primarch with the deepest natural connection to the immaterium and the most capacity to handle carefully curated knowledge about chaos. Keeping Magnus as ignorant as Angron about the nature of the warp wasn't defensible strategically, and it contributed directly to the catastrophe at Prospero. That's a real Emperor failure, worth naming. But comparative culpability doesn't dissolve because both sides have failures. The comparative question is categorical. Which failure was worse in its consequences? The Emperor kept dangerous information from his sons because he had directly observed what that information, and the behavior it encouraged, did to civilizations. He applied the policy too broadly. That's a miscalculation within a strategy built around humanity's survival. Erda removed the only physical protection standing between 20 genetically engineered demigods and the realm of gods who wanted to use them. She did this unilaterally, based on a moral assessment she couldn't fully verify, using a method she knew would expose her children to the one category of threat the Emperor had spent millennia constructing defenses against. Her bust inscription is explicit that her knowledge of chaos is beyond dispute. She knew what lived on the other side of those wards. She dismantled them anyway. The Emperor's failure was strategic miscalculation applied too broadly. Erda's failure handed chaos 20 potential champions. Now back to the comment that opened this. At Son of the Heavy Metal 1142, they think Guilliman came out right because he had a mom. I don't think being raised by Guillimom wouldn't change the other Primarchs by much. The nurture argument for Guilliman's stability, the care of Tarasha Uton, his foster mother on Macragge, sounds compelling until you examine what the scattering actually put the other Primarchs into. The assumption is that parenting was the decisive variable. 3 specific cases demonstrate it wasn't. Angron didn't land on a planet that lacked good parenting. He landed on Nuceria. The Lexicanum's Butcher's Nails entry is specific. The implant technology originated on Nuceria, used by the ruling aristocracy on gladiatorial slaves to enhance their fighting capacity. These were crude neural devices driven directly into the prefrontal cortex. They rewired the brain's reward architecture. Aggression produced chemical release, while calm produced escalating physical agony. They weren't a medical technology. They were a torture technology that happened to make slaves fight harder. Angron was captured and enslaved before the Emperor ever found him. The nails went into his skull before any Primarch legion arrived on Nuceria. By the time the Emperor encountered Angron in 899 M30, his capacity for emotional equilibrium had been systematically burned out by hardware that couldn't be removed without killing him. No surrogate mother on Nuceria was going to undo what the butcher's nails did to his prefrontal cortex. The world broke him before he could be raised. Conrad Kurz landed on Nostromo, described by the Lexicanum as a hive world in perpetual darkness, orbiting a dying sun in the Ultima Segmentum, its society built on endemic corruption and unchecked violence. His earliest memory was of slum dwellers. No caretaker raised him. Nostromo didn't damage him through absent parenting. It was structurally designed to produce exactly this psychology, one generation at a time, a machine running on darkness and predation. He grew up haunted by precognitive visions of death and destruction before he had any framework to process them, surrounded by a society that confirmed their content at every level. 1,000 compassionate foster mothers couldn't have rebuilt a psyche formed in that permanent dark. He was rediscovered by the Emperor in 896 M30. Decades of Nostromo had already done the work. Mortarion on Barbarus is the starkest case. Barbarus was a toxic death world perpetually shrouded in poisonous fog, its surface inhabited by a struggling human population, while necromantic warlords ruled from above the poison line in the clearer air. The High Overlord of Barbarus, Necaer, found the infant Primarch and took him in, not out of compassion. The Lexicanum records the naming directly. Necaer called him Mortarion, child of death, and raised him with the specific intention of creating a son and heir who would serve as a weapon. Barbarus didn't produce a broken Primarch despite its surrogate father. Necaer was the surrogate father. His pedagogy was structured exposure to death, decay, and the grinding attrition of existence. Mortarion's obsession with endurance, with toxins as a spiritual framework, with mortality as the only honest currency. Barbarus wrote these into him from infancy, and the hand holding the pen was Necaer's. Hold all three of those images together. Angron's ruined prefrontal cortex, the hardware already in his skull when the Emperor arrived. Kurz alone in the permanent dark, prophecy-haunted, shaped by decades of Nostromo before anyone found him. Mortarion in Necaer's hands, being systematically taught that suffering was the only real lesson. These aren't stories about absent parenting. These are stories about deliberate environmental placement, specific worlds producing specific psychological outcomes in specific Primarchs. The Lexicanum's Primarch entry records something that illuminates how widely this was understood within the lore. Conrad Kurz, Robute Guilliman, and Sanguinius all eventually came to believe the scattering and their subsequent upbringings had been deliberately engineered. Several Primarchs suspected their own father of placing them. They were right that the placement was engineered. They had the wrong parent. Macragge wasn't stable because it had a wise foster mother. Macragge was a stable, law-governed, culturally developed society that produced a statesman-scholar Primarch. Tarasha Uten was an expression of Macragge's culture. Chagoris produced Jagatai Khan, a world of nomadic war culture producing a Primarch who valued martial freedom and speed, loyal but resistant to bureaucratic hierarchy. Fenris produced Leman Russ, a near-death world that valued physical strength above everything, producing a Primarch who operated on exactly those terms. The worlds shaped the Primarchs. The parenting expressed the world. Chaos didn't scatter 20 pods at random and happen to get lucky with the outcomes. The opening Erda created was a window of access that had never existed before and would never exist again, and the ruinous powers moved through it with whatever precision was available to them. Whether those landing destinations were selected with surgical intent or simply optimized from available options, 8 of those 20 pods ended up somewhere calibrated to the damage of whoever was inside. The pattern is too consistent to read as coincidence. Erda didn't choose those worlds, but she gave the entities who chose them their only opportunity to act. A caveat honesty requires. Erda may be an unreliable narrator of her own act. When she tells John Grammaticus, I took them from him, that is her understanding. The canonical reading across Warhawk and the Primarch Project entry is that she dismantled the Emperor's protective wards, which allowed the Chaos Gods to breach and scatter the Primarchs through the subsequent warp exposure. The physical dispersal across the galaxy was chaos exploiting the breach she created. The Argel-Tal causal loop, time-displaced word-bearers disabling Geller field generators, remains a possible concurrent explanation, preserved in the Lexicanum as a historical alternative. What's consistent across all versions is that Erda's sabotage was the necessary enabling condition. Everything else passed through that hinge. Most lore channels covering the scattering stop at the Argel-Tal account. The time-displaced word-bearers make for a clean story. Chaos as the active architect, the Emperor as the victim, no uncomfortable human responsibility. Saturnine and Warhawk complicated that story significantly. They gave the act a human face, a confession, and a motivation. That's what makes Erda difficult to discuss. Chaos as the villain is clean and satisfying. Erda as the villain is more troubling, because her motivation was love. Erebus came for her in her garden during the siege of Terra, while the imperial palace burned less than 3,000 kilometers to the north. He offered her a place in Chaos's victory. She refused. She didn't submit. He told her to worship him. She spat blood in his face. He killed her with a blade made from a shard of the anatheme, a weapon specifically engineered to close the loop of perpetual resurrection permanently. She died refusing every offer Chaos extended to her. The Emperor never sought her out beforehand. The Lexicanum records this explicitly. He raged at her betrayal, and then left her alone in Mauritania for the decades between the scattering and the siege of Terra, despite knowing her location. He found his Primarchs one by one across the galaxy, built the Great Crusade from the genetic fragments he had salvaged, fought the Heresy, watched the siege close around his palace, and never once moved against the woman who had made all of it possible. The lore gives no clean answer for why. One possibility, he calculated with the cold precision he applied to everything, that pursuing her changed nothing already in motion. The Primarchs were scattered. The Great Crusade would proceed with Space Marines instead of the 20 he had planned. Retribution against Erda solved no tactical problem. Another, whatever prophetic sight he possessed showed him a timeline in which her continued existence served some purpose he never articulated. Another, the emotional weight of acting against her, the woman who had given him the Primarchs before she took them, was a cost the Emperor couldn't rationalize into policy, even at the scale of the Imperium. Or perhaps he understood that she had believed she was saving them, that she had been instrumentalized by chaos through a door opened by genuine love rather than malice, that she was the most tragic figure in a story full of tragic figures, a being 30,000 years old who had stayed when everyone else left, who had given her genetic code to a project she believed in, and who had destroyed its foundation in a single night because the emperor wouldn't let her near her children. Whatever his reasoning, the emperor took it to the golden throne. Erda took her full understanding of what she'd done to Guelb, the complete interior logic of that decision, the full weight of what a woman with 30,000 years of chaos knowledge understood she was risking when she dismantled those wards, died in Mauritania in 014 M31. No inquisitor can reconstruct it from primary sources. The knowledge of the Primarch project's first great act of sabotage belongs entirely to the past. Nobody in the subsequent 10 millennia knows the full story. No record survives that answers the question with certainty. The galaxy burns carrying a wound it can't fully trace to its origin. The comment from @son_of_the_heavy metal 1142 had it right before the evidence was assembled. The worlds were the variable, not the parenting. Guilliman didn't come out stable because Tarasha Uton cared for him. He came out stable because Macragge was stable, and stable worlds produce stable Primarchs. The foster mother was an expression of the world that made her. The emperor was a cold father. The novels are consistent about this. He told Archon Land in The Master of Mankind that he felt no emotional attachment to the Primarchs because they were tools and weapons. His secrecy about chaos was applied so broadly it prevented even Magnus, the son best positioned to handle that knowledge carefully, from receiving it. These are real failures, made by a real person with real blind spots. But the Emperor's failures happened inside his project. His worst decisions were strategic miscalculations within a plan built around humanity's survival as its terminal purpose. He made wrong calls while trying to win. Erda tore the project apart at its foundation. She acted unilaterally, based on a moral reading of the Emperor's intentions she couldn't fully verify, using a method she knew would expose her children to the one category of threat the Emperor had spent millennia constructing protections against. Her knowledge of chaos was beyond dispute. She removed the wards anyway. The galaxy burns because of what she did. Not entirely. The Chaos Gods were already there. The traitor Primarchs made their own choices. The Heresy had 100 interlocking causes that fed each other across decades. But the inciting act that gave the ruinous powers their opening, the moment that turned the Emperor's most secure laboratory into a gateway, that was Erda. They think Guilliman came out right because he had a mom.
The truth is, the one mother who mattered, the only person in the Primarch story who contributed half the genetics and then made a unilateral decision that changed everything, used that position to expose her children to gods who had been waiting for exactly this opening. The Emperor wasn't a bad father. He was betrayed by the one person he trusted. Subscribe for more stories like this one.